Good morning, everyone. I am thrilled to present our next speaker today, Professor Igor Logvinenko. Professor Logvinenko teaches, researches, and writes about global political economy and its relationship to politics and policy making in low and middle income countries. He is an associate professor of diplomacy and world affairs and an affiliate of the John Park Young Initiative on the global political economy at Occidental College. He received a doctorate in government from Cornell University in 2015 and has held appointments at the Cornell and Washington program, the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, the Monterey Institute for International Studies, and most importantly, Wellesley College, where, as he has told me, he deeply misses the students. His book, Global Finance and Local Control, Corruption and Wealth in Contemporary Russia, was published in the Cornell Studies in Money series at Cornell University Press in 2021. His research and commentary have appeared in publications such as Communist and Post-Communist Studies, Democratization, Europe-Asia Studies, Review of International Political Economy, Just Security, and the Moscow Times. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Logvinenko.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Professor Dyer, for inviting me. I spent 5 years at Wellesley College, a memorable experience. Having left a couple of years ago, I definitely, really reflect and think fondly on my time here, and just the kind of a special atmosphere that exists at Wellesley, and the relationship that's possible between faculty and students who are so academically oriented and interested in learning and talking about new ideas. So the topic is democracy and the rule of law, 23 and beyond, and predicting the future is a terribly bad idea in our discipline. But I would say that I want to kind of give you my own broad thinking about the state of democracy and the rule of law in the world, and I'll touch a little bit on my book that came out a couple of years ago that deals with one particular element of this relationship between democracy, autocracy, and the rule of law in the age of globalization, and we can be done. So I'm from Kyrgyzstan. I was born in Kyrgyzstan in post-Soviet, Central Asia, in '83. So I was, this is Bishkek, capital of Kyrgyzstan. This was me when I was maybe, I figured 5, 6, 7 years old or something like that. I think the Soviet Union still existed. My sister was younger and my parents were also quite young. Right around this time, I figure right around this picture, this man here was writing about the end of history. He wrote a famous article in 1989, and then this book came out, The End of History in the Last Man. You heard of Francis Fukuyama? Yeah. Okay. So the book has been much maligned and made fun of because the history obviously didn't end, and he really didn't mean that the history was literally ending. The argument is actually quite sophisticated, and even though he might have turned out to be wrong, what he said and the way he framed this conversation in the post in 89, 91 post-Cold War era, the era of globalization, the modern era of democratization, really. Created this kind of water that we're all been swimming on in terms of talking about capitalism and democracy ever since. And what he argues essentially is that the battle of ideas between different ways of organizing governments, human societies, and the economy was coming to an end, or ended. There were no alternatives to kind of a synthesis of some kind of a liberal democracy and some kind of regulated capitalism, let's say, or free market economy. And while that debate existed somewhat, maybe you could argue during the Cold War, there was this alternative of state socialism, and autocracy, party-led autocracy. The world was out of alternatives. It was the end of history in a sense. It was the end of the debate about that question. And so, how that works, generally speaking, one way for thinking about democracy is to think about it in multiple dimensions. So, the government or the leader or the executive is controlled by various other actors in the system. So there's oversight bodies, let's say the parliament or the judiciary, that introduces checks on the actions of the executive. You have actual voters who are voting in elections and can reasonably expect to vote the incumbent out of power. And there's various other things that are happening here to make sure that that actually is free and fair. Like media and civil society organizations that are making sure that elections are monitored and there's freedom of the press, freedom of expression, equality of access to the information sphere. There's also kind of an oversight that's happening on the relationship between these different government bodies. And so all of this is a kind of a complicated combination of freedom of expression, human rights, kind of institutional accountability, checks and balances, repeated elections, access to the polls, and the like. And so there's various arguments and varieties of ways of organizing this in slightly different ways. But more or less, this was the solution. There were many autocracies at that time, and the number of them was declining. So Kuyama wasn't entirely wrong in the sense that the book was written right around here. And prior to that time, essentially for most of recorded, when we have data going back to about the year 1800, autocracies and milder version of autocracies or non-democracies, they're called anocracies, it's just they can't categorize them really into anything else. But more or less, democracy has been on the rise since the middle 19th century, and it exploded after the publication of the book, after the end of the Cold War. And these other forms of government, in particular these closed, really restrictive, repressive systems, were really on the decline. So something that was happening, and there was this sense of kind of a final end. Kuyama builds on, say Hegel, going back to the 18th, 19th centuries, and there was this notion of a teleological kind of reasoning. There was an end in sight. All the countries were going to become democracies, and that seemed sort of inevitable. Now, what began happening maybe about 10 years ago, and I teach about this stuff occasionally, and to students of your generation, telling this long story of how there's been this rise in democracy and spread of democracy, and even declines in inequality and rise in the standards of living of population globally. Sometimes that sounds really strange to you because most of you came of age politically probably right around here. And this is the time when we see in dynamic terms, in terms of the way things are moving, things start moving in the opposite direction. So there are these categories of contracting or moderately contracting democracies. So democracies that have been stable and functioning began introducing elements of authoritarian governance. The process has been referred to as autocratization, difficult to pronounce, even if you try multiple times. And then there's a category of these severely contracting democracies. Where the situation has really gotten quite bad, and you can even speak about a kind of popular autocracy. If you think about Hungary today, Hungary is a completely, closed off politically, lots of control on media expression, very restrictive politically, member of the European Union, member of NATO, and effectively the country's become an autocracy in the last 5-7 years. Now this is more difficult to decipher, and I don't necessarily want you to try to figure this out. But what's notable here, if you look at by weighted population, in terms of how many people actually live in these different types of regimes, you see that overall, this is for the world, you know, the number of democracies, the average democracy score in the world was rising, and it kind of plateaued in the first decade of this century, and then it began declining. And the trends are sort of similar across region, and they're a little less pronounced if you don't weigh by population. And then you see here, this is Europe, I believe. Yeah, you see this kind of dip there as well. So, the overall, the broader trends are positive, but the last decade or so, we've seen a significant contraction in the number of democracy, in the quality of governance, in the quality of the rule of law. This is from the BDAM Institute, which does follows this data authoritatively. This is their latest report. You know, alarmingly, I didn't even really realize this until I looked at this. The number of liberal democracies peaked in 2012, and now it's at the lowest level in 25 years. There's an increasing number of autocracies from 25 to 30. Electoral autocracy remains the most common regime type, with 44% of the world's population. 35 countries have suffered significant deterioration in freedom of expression. They have this idea of toxic polarization, which has been spreading all around functioning democracies. If you followed the news from Brazil the last couple of days, you certainly would recognize what toxic polarization looks like. Broadly speaking, so the oversight of judiciary, legislation, and media, that horizontal, vertical of accountability. Here we see the trend is that it declined in more countries than not in the last year, and in fact, in this whole stretch of time, it's been on the decline. Globally, you can see the trends, the dynamic changes that are happening is that we see actually relatively few places with improvements. And we see significant declines in most of Latin America, in the United States, in Mexico. The United States was placed on the list of autocratizing countries for the first time in 2020, I believe. And certainly most of post-Soviet Eurasia, great swaths of Central Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Middle East, most of Asia. So geographically, the trends don't look good. So the first problem then with this Fukuyamian synthesis is that these democratic principles and principles of liberal democracy have not been universalizing. So the standard for Fukuyama for an idea that was truly being debated and discussed and in competition with something else, it had to be universalizing appeal. So for example, nationalism cannot be this universal idea, because nationalism is necessarily national, local, exclusionary. And in terms of these universal ideas, democracy is a universal idea. It, in principle, can be applied in any setting. It doesn't have any kind of commitment to ethnos or language or culture or religion, but the process wasn't really happening, or was slowing down by over the last 10, 20 years, depending on how you count. So that's one of the reasons to perhaps say that Fukuyama was wrong. Now, the rule of law has a variety of these elements, and there's various ways of measuring and talking about it, there's philosophical distinctions. I think in the simplest sense, if you think about horizontal accountability, checks on the executive from the courts and from the parliament, that's one way of thinking about a rule of law. Another way of thinking about rule of law is accountability of the government to the public through elections. But there's a number of other things that go into making sure that that system functions. And so, you have some constraints that are broadly defined. This is the World Justice Project, which has a good data set on all this. They have this way of measuring how open the government is. Order and security. So, for example, if you have a disorderly society, where you have parts of the territory that are not controlled by the government, or significant levels of criminality and disorder, then going to the polls becomes very difficult. It's not really a democracy if you don't feel safety, let's say, to go to the polls, even if elections are run fairly. So that's also important. Civil justice, criminal justice. You need these agencies in the government that are not necessarily even, they're sort of outside of politics a little bit, so that they can regulate the economy, regulate other aspects, of development, construction codes, environment, and the like. So when the complete network of norms and institutions that sustains a rule of law, environment, or a liberal democracy is complicated, and I don't necessarily want to go into each one of those elements. And so this is from Transparency International. Also, just wanted to regionally show you how things are looking with reference to specific countries. So my home region of sort of former Soviet Eurasia, let's call it, Georgia and Armenia are kind of looking pretty good. They're at the 15th, but they're still quite corrupt. Lots of problems there. My own country declined quite a bit in the last few years. Real low scores here. In Europe, Northern European countries do well. There's significant declines in East Central Europe. They're not doing so well. The two sort of most famous case studies now in Europe of democratization is Hungary and Poland. Really significant declines over the last decade. In the Middle East, it's interesting, especially if you think about sort of human rights and related issues. These countries score maybe surprisingly high, but in terms of regulation of commerce and economic activity and public safety and the like, probably bureaucratic management is quite high. In North America, note that the United States ranks below Uruguay, on par with Chile, and Canada is the top scorer, but also isn't really at the level of North European countries. In Africa, just a couple of highlights. Pretty bleak picture overall, but Botswana looks good, as it always does. Seychelles, I don't know. But overall, the picture is the state of rule of law in Africa has not been trending in a great direction as well. In Asia, broadly speaking, we have New Zealand, Singapore. Singapore is not a democracy, but it always scores at the very top of rule of law rankings because of a highly efficient government, let's say, and relatively open markets. Hong Kong as well, and then Cambodia, Afghanistan, North Korea at the bottom here. Now, just so that's sort of broadly on the side of democracy. Let's just briefly talk about the state of free markets, let's say, and the spread of globalization over this period of time. So again, if you go back centuries, you'll see that you can kind of even see that the globalization has been kind of a multi-century long phenomenon. But the really big era in which we live has been an era of exploding, globalization, economic interdependence. We had this first episode in the late 19th century, then we had all this terrible business of world wars in the first part of the 20th century, but then there was this huge recovery, and by this one measure, as in integration into global trade, or trade as a proportion of global GDP, we've seen this enormous rise, and this globalization has been the primary driving force of the global economy of the last 50, 70 years. Once again, you're looking at the sort of the way you may have seen this picture from your vantage point. We've seen this increase going back to 1973. It's not clear when the modern age of globalization is, when you date it, 1971, 1980, sometimes it's used. But we see this tremendous increase as well. So Fukuyama is looking at this world right here, and he's probably right to see a correlation there between globalization and democracy. But then it stays quite high, but then it stagnates, and into your vintage point of your lifetime, of you coming of age politically, you probably have seen stagnating levels of globalization, and in fact, some signs of de-globalization during this time. And I began sort of observing this idea that while the levels of globalization are quite high, and somebody like Fukuyama and a number of other writers believed that sort of capitalism, globalization would lead to democracy, that democracies would engage with free markets and globalization more. And what you start seeing right around this time as well is that authoritarian governments, turns out, are very adept and quite eager to participate in globalization, and it doesn't seem to lead to any kind of human rights or rule of law or openness or democracy or like. This was one of my favorite headlines. It sort of reads definitely from a different era, but this is in 2013. IMF advises China to be cautious with capital account liberalization. So historically, China has been very cautious about opening the economy to financial flows for good reasons and political reasons and complicated reasons. And there's multiple episodes of Chinese government aiming to open up in the course of economic transformation that began in 1979. There was this effort to do this in the late 80s, early 90s, and then the Tiananmen Square kind of pushed that agenda back by a few years. Then there was this effort in the mid-1990s to do it. The Asian financial crisis, which happened in Korea, really spooked Chinese leadership. They decided to postpone it. Then they started opening up a little bit more in the early 2000s, and the global financial crisis happened, and China actually did somewhat well during that time because of its relatively close capital account. Anyway, by 2011, 2012, the thinking on the right way of regulating globalization actually changed somewhat at the IMF, and the Chinese government has become much more open to the idea of fully integrating into the global financial system. So this headline wouldn't have made sense very much at any point in time before, 2010, 2011, because China was always the laggard. China didn't want to give up all these levers of regulatory control over the economy. By 2017, we have this strange situation where Xi Jinping actually speaking at Davos in defense of globalization. There's all these headlines over in business press and elsewhere that China is taking the mantle of globalization. Here, this is on the heels, of course, of 2016, Brexit, election of Donald Trump, this sort of wave of popular authoritarianism, anti-globalization, both on the left and the right, but primarily on the right. And so he steps onto the stage talking about, we have benefited so much from globalization. We should keep this going. This kind of competition is healthy, and it's really kind of an interesting symbolic moment. And it is true, if you plot the data, this is for that decade where things kind of started teetering a little bit. So if you plot, this is an autocracy score from -10 to 10. Most autocratic here, most democratic there. And then if you look at capital controls, how open the country is to the flow of money in and out of the country. It's one of the indicators of how globalized the country is. And so if Fukuyama is right, the line should look something like this. The more democratic you are, the more open your economy ought to be, because those things are supposed to go together. And it's true here, certainly, but you have all of these countries that are very autocratic, but are incredibly open. And you can bunch some of these guys in between as well. And so, and actually in the following decade, things looked even more, because autocratization, countries continue to become more authoritarian. Even really closed-off countries that already became authoritarian, like Russia, by 2010, they became even more authoritarian. They became even more closed-off, even more repressive. Same goes for China. So the second problem with Fukuyamian synthesis, in retrospect, is this idea that capitalism and globalization, maybe it works just as well in autocracies. Maybe better. Maybe there's some reasons to believe why it could work better. For example, capital owners in autocracies perhaps have to worry less about worker rights. Ironically, entrepreneurs in China have to worry less about rights of workers than do their counterparts in the West, in the United States, and in fact, before this big decoupling that really began under Biden, you often hear from entrepreneurs who, let's say, who are from China or of Chinese origin, are able to speak Mandarin and thinking about setting up companies in China or the United States. Often the kind of argument was, look, we don't, we can hire workers who work, 9 to 9, 7 days a week, whatever it is. It's something that's difficult culturally and also legally in the United States. So there's reasons to, these two things are going together. They're coexisting pretty well, capitalism and authoritarianism, and in fact, there's reasons to believe that maybe that's better. Now, the particular angle of this that I worked on for a long time and wrote this book about it that came out a couple of years ago was about this question of financial integration, capital openness, flow of money into Russia while it was becoming more and more authoritarian. So it's kind of a story about how Russia became a closed-up authoritarian country that ultimately invaded this and turned into I think effectively now is a fascist state, and how it maintained this process declining. This is one index of democracy, voice, and accountability in the World Bank. Declining levels of voice and accountability and increasing levels of openness. It became more and more open as it became less and less politically free. So this is the book that I wrote mostly while I was at Wellesley College. And so let me tell you a little bit about what happened in that story, and then the questions. I love to when I talk about the book. I love showing this picture. This is Moscow downtown, and this is a picture of Moscow you don't really see, but it was completely built in the last 20 years. It didn't exist before, and the idea was the creation of kind of a modern global metropolis with headquarters of major corporations, and so it looks like any kind of major global city. If you zoom out, though, of course, the Moscow city, as it's known, kind of can be seen from behind the walls of the Kremlin, and everybody who understands Russian politics even a little bit understands that most of the main decisions are, of course, made in the Kremlin, and major mergers and acquisitions, big investment projects from foreign companies, how these resources are distributed among the elites and the broader population. These are all questions that are not really up for debate. They're not debated in courts. They're not debated in public. They're decided inside these walls, metaphorically speaking, of the Kremlin. And I wrote about this. How is it possible that autocracy and capitalism combine so well, or this facet of capitalism combines so well in Russia? I essentially argue that it was led by this group of super wealthy oligarchs who made their money during this corrupt period of privatization, when most of the Soviet state-owned assets were distributed, sold off, privatized in unseemly ways to a group of basically, I guess, very capable business people, if they're able to do it. By all accounts, they used their ability to get access to government officials or by funding their political campaigns, but most of these were kind of self-started people for the most part. They came from nothing, but nevertheless, just a few of them wound up with a lot of this wealth, and they did this in the absence of the rule of law, and so they got all their money through these schemes that were indefensible, really, once you start looking at them, and it's the absence of the rule of law, broadly speaking, that allowed them to acquire those assets. Once they have those assets, the absence of the rule of law makes it difficult for them to protect it from other people. And so it's this kind of a dilemma. And so what they do then is they begin, these are some of the examples. This is so the Russia's wealthiest man, Roman Abramovich, used to use Chelsea soccer club most famously. Some other folks that are his friends. And so I argue in the book essentially that it's the technology of global finance, the technology of electrified and interconnected global stock markets that gets installed in Russia. Russia had, until 2022, one of the most modern stock markets that was fully accessible to global investors and Russian asset owners who move money in and out through it fully legally beginning in 2006. And it's through this kind of roundabout mechanism of settling property rights and defending property rights in other jurisdictions. Most of the settlement of these These transactions happen outside of Russia's territory, literally in Belgium or in the Netherlands, let's say. And the electronic stock markets are effectively a modern version of what is a bill of exchange, let's say, or this financial technology that allows for transaction between multiple parties. They don't know each other in a reliable way by essentially guaranteeing third parties guaranteeing that the exchange of assets takes place. This is Montesquieu writing about these primarily Jewish traders in northern Italy. In the Middle Ages, it talks about how what makes merchants more independent is that their goods are outside of the reach of the sovereign's hands. He argues in part, many things, but in part, he argued that the introduction of the Bill of Exchange made possible for entrepreneurs, traders, kind of escape the heavy hand of the state, and in turn give rise to this merchant class that was able to somehow limit the power of despotism in Europe at that time. Bill of Exchange was also developed in ancient China. It was not a European invention, but it was sort of something that made sense in the context of commerce between people who don't know each other. I talked about this. And so beginning 2006, this is also a strange picture. Most of these people are out of power, of course. Angela Merkel, most recently, she was still a young chancellor. But Putin is still in power, George W. Bush. This is a G8 summit in St. Petersburg, Russia in July of 2006. And this was sort of another symbolic representation of Russia. It was by then quite authoritarian already, being welcomed back into the sort of world as being a leading global power, participant in the global economy, and the like. And things have gone downhill politically pretty much ever since, while in the meantime, Russian government introduced all these reforms to become more and more embedded in the global financial system, removed capital controls in 2006, introduced a fully free-floating ruble, which they stopped just earlier this year in 2022, after the start of the war, joined these clearing houses, allowed the system of sponsored market access. I used to kind of joke with students that even in the midst of these allegations of Russia's interference in the elections of 2016, or poisoning former operatives in the UK, or annexing Crimea, or banning adoptions of Russian children, disabled children, list can go on for forever. I would always say, you can pull up an app on your phone in about 5 minutes. If you have a bank account, you can start a bank account. You can start trading Russian securities at any moment, and you could do it right now until February, March of this year. Anybody could do it, and that was no longer the case in March, February of this year, when the war started. Hundreds of companies left Russia. Heavier sanctions were introduced, and finally, just because of the turbulence that ensued in the markets, the Central Bank of Russia had to introduce capital controls. I read a little article about this very well. And so we're now in the situation where going back to the time of publication of Fukuyama's of this book, or this argument. This was a picture of the Kaczynski's statue coming down in Lubyanka Square in Russia, the headquarters of the KGB, famous torture prison as well in there. And so by 2002, they're taking down the McDonald's signs in Russia. So maybe we're returning to some kind of a notion where maybe Russia will be less and less integrated into the global financial system, or less globalized generally, and become this sort of standard expectation of an autocracy in this age, as a kind of closed-off, autarkic, independent from the rest of the world, but quite poor and the like. So this is where we stand with this food. Actually, I have this picture there. But just in terms of the beyond, this is the last slide, and then we'll be done. So one thing to think about, one thing, the broader lesson that could be taken away is the importance of recognizing the difference between thinking about a problem in static terms and dynamic terms. When you look at 200 years of democratization or 200 years of economic growth. And it says over time, things are getting better or improving, you could say. It's hard to dispute that argument. But dynamically, in each different time period, things could be getting better or getting worse. And understanding why that's happening is quite important. And things have been getting worse in the last 10 years. There's no doubt about it. Fukuyama's synthesis turned out to be wrong, but it was wrong in a useful way. There really aren't any persuasive universal alternatives to this combination of free markets and democracy. If you think of one, let me know. I'll just ask students. I haven't heard a good one yet. Nationalism is an alternative, kind of xenophobia, kind of autarky, but they're not really universal ideas. Another thing that's worth pointing out is that globalization is actually very popular among the young people in the low-income emerging market economies. It's hugely popular in Vietnam, Philippines, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, all with approval ratings of over 70 or 80%. It's not the case in Australia, France, the United States, but it's pretty much the case in most of the rest of the world, outside of the kind of rich West. Other thing to say, I think there's a reaction happening and it's slow and it's taken some time, but this recognition or renewed recognition about abuse of human rights or lack of rule of law or authoritarian governance and its dangers, particularly what we've learned in the course of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the dangers of autocracy. And there's this understanding of, there's new laws that have been passed in the United States that truthfully really made it much more difficult to set up offshore funds and to have anonymous companies in places like Delaware or South Dakota and the like. There's this new understanding, particularly with the Inflation Reduction Act passage and this massive spending that's happening in the United States to reorient the economy towards a circular, environmentally more sustainable alternative energy economy. There's this understanding that participation in that big project over the next decade or two by other countries is conditional on them being having similar governance priorities and systems. It's again, these are dynamic changes. I think still, of course, the United States still does business with Saudi Arabia. Of course, we will jump on the opportunity to have a closer relationship with Iran if it made sense, if it made it more difficult for Russia to stop its aggression in Ukraine. It continues to have a really close relationship with China, and so the same goes for the European countries. Olaf Scholz just famously made a trip to China. But I do think that there's a little bit more awareness of the notion that, look, once we, let's say, Americans believed that introduction of free markets will eventually lead to rise of democracy, human rights, people will demand better governance. That really hasn't happened in the way that American foreign policy makers expected. And I think perhaps there's this new realization that it's not markets first, but maybe it's a little bit more human rights and democracy first. And again, I feel like it's a trend in its very early stages, but I think it is something that's happening and something to pay attention to. So, yes, I'll end here. Thank you.
I am going to grab the handheld mic, both to ask the first question, but also to be able to take around to fellows who have questions, if you don't mind me taking the prerogative of the first question. So actually this picks up where you ended, which is the question of markets first and everything else follows versus rule of law. And I want to touch a little bit on your work with kleptocracy and the rise of especially you focus on the actors in Russia that managed to in many ways suck up all this capital, right? obviously that's not something we see as only in Russia. This has kind of become a transnational phenomenon of actors who are able to suck up and hold all this capital. And B, one thing you point with the rule of law is the way in which the current rule of law globally is insufficient to deal with it, right? I mean, in other words, it allows actors to either engage on kind of the soft end evasion of things like taxes at a minimal, or outright money laundering and criminal enterprises. This is too big of a question, but if you were to point to various places, not just in domestic rule of law, but global rule of law, to begin to kind of break apart this kleptocracy or undercut this concentration of capital, where would you point to?
Well, so in terms of where it's mostly concentrated, or I mean the resistance to it?
How would you break apart the resistance to having rule of law?
Yeah. Well, so, what happens, I used to think it was really a political story. It's definitely really a political story. A lot of it is a technological story, actually. Well, it has to do, just a broader story. It's about this technology exists, this technology for instantaneous electronic settlement of transactions across borders. That technology exists, and I think it played a lot bigger of a role. And so, like, stopping that technology, because things are shifting to blockchain and cryptocurrency in this big important way. But I would say that I'm not in a world of Western activists who argue for anti-kleptocracy initiatives, but I'm familiar with some of the arguments, and the frustration was always that the Western governments were not enforcing their own laws. So there was this kind of looking the other way. There were all of these examples of Delaware legislation being in conflict with money laundering post 9/11, laws on banks, the sort of steps that banks needed to take to monitor money, and then this dynamic generally that I'm sure you're aware of there's this kind of tacit competition between the United States and the United Kingdom going back to the early 1970s in terms of who can be the least regulated sort of major Western economy. And the UK was always leading the way. So UK, but they've made some major progress. The Defense Authorization Act last year introduced new, everything is defense, also in the United States. And so they've introduced really significant money laundering, barriers. But then you look at where the money went, and it went to places like Singapore, Dubai, and so these are not democracies exactly, but these people believe that their money is safe there or something. So I would say that overall things are looking better, again, in terms of the trends. They're looking better in the United States, they're looking better in Europe on money laundering, on kleptocracy. But I think it's a game of whack-a-mole in some sense, and it has to do a lot with technology, technological innovation that exists. So it's a long-winded answer.
No, not at all. I have a few more questions, but I'd actually like to open it up to the fellows.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I wanted to ask, in your view, there's this idea in the U.S. that there's on both sides an interest in deglobalizing or closing the U.S. off more to trade, building these tariffs and stuff. Yeah, right. And the optimistic view, I think that you may have mentioned, was that there's perhaps more of a focus on the environment and human rights. But critics are also saying that they're really only taking these measures temporarily because China is taking advantage of and opening its market more, et cetera, et cetera. And that this isn't actually a substantive movement towards deglobalization in the U.S. or an interest in it. So I was just wondering what your view was on this.
Well, I think ask yourself what are some continuities in the foreign policies of the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And I think you will see that there's been continuity on this. Trump was much more bombastic about America first. But Biden put into the largest government investment effectively in onshoring and manufacturing, building these new economies. So much so that not just China, which has all kinds of issues with that, and there have been directives by the Biden administration that made it difficult for people with dual citizenships in China and the United States to work in the sensitive areas. That was a big blow to a lot of those companies. But there's actually a real outcry in Europe, which is the United States' closest economic partner, for sure, about the types of subsidies and the type of spending for this project that's happening in the United States, actually happening, not just being talked about in the case of Trump, but it's actually happening that's making a lot of this new kind of electric vehicle, industrial manufacturing supply chain makes it much more advantageous to do it in the United States. And so it's not so much it's this America first in practice that's happening under Biden. I think it's going to have interesting challenges and reviews in the WTO. We'll figure out if the WTO still matters, I think so. But so it's not so much about China. It is this new consensus in the United States about bringing, subsidizing, and supporting manufacturing, this new manufacturing base being built in the United States. And there's interesting negotiations. I think Professor Goddard might know more about these things, but there's interesting behind-the-scenes negotiations of how New Zealand might be included or excluded, Australia on what conditions, and all of this has to do with, of course, Asia-Pacific politics. And I think there's going to be interesting new agreements and negotiations with the Europeans, make it possible to manufacture some of these things in Europe. And so, but it will be this kind of West, America-led West, where this is going to be happening. And the participation in that world is going to be conditional on other factors, whereas the globalization project was truly universalist in its approach.
Thank you so much, Professor Igor. My name's Ella, and you're actually my world politics professor in summer 2019 when I was still in high school, coming here for the summer pre-college immersive program. So and that class was actually the inspiration point for me to come to Wellesley and study political science. And that's true. And so my question is, as you said, there's like rising conditions in accessing Western market for like business or companies coming from Russia and China that are holding like more authoritarian regime. What implications do you think that trend would be in our like global economic development and also to the rest of the world market, like Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America, and Africa, where places might still be able to provide a safe haven for like Russia and China market and like companies? What do you think would the West do to these developing worlds to have them join the U.S.?
So in terms of how the competition, it's a very nice thing. I don't believe you, but it's a very nice thing to say. I appreciate it. But the lower income, how the implications for the lower income world, so to speak. Yeah. I would say there's definitely been, China's government has invested and pledged a great deal of resources in lower income countries through the Belt and Road Initiative and other similar initiatives. And so, but it was usually in places where there wasn't really direct competition for that sort of. The United States was never really in position for the last 20, 30 years to do those types of projects. And so it wasn't really a direct competition. But yeah, I think there's definitely going to be this, renewed rivalry for economic influence, political influence in the low-income world. I think ultimately, where the United States and the West continue to have an advantage, and it has something to do with the rule of law, is the idea that the sort of economic engine or the churn of capitalism sort of seems to work better in the area of inventing and patenting new technologies. And so at the higher echelons of some of these more sophisticated technologies around battery technology, around semiconductors, energy innovation, it still seems to be happening in the United States. and it still seems to be very welcoming to entrepreneurs. You know statistics about CEOs of Silicon Valley companies. Half of them are immigrants and the like, and number of immigrants who are starting these companies. And so, for some reason, the United States and the West more broadly still seem to have an advantage there. And then presumably, when the lower-income countries hopefully enter the ranks of middle-income countries and begin demanding some of these more sophisticated technologies or manufacturing capabilities, the idea, I think, is that they would ultimately turn to Western countries for those things. I think that's whether or not that's true, the extent to which the assumptions that I've made in that are accurate and debatable. I'm willing to have a conversation there, of course, but I think that's the idea.
Hello. Thank you so much for this talk. It was so interesting. You talked a lot about how, especially in the turn of this century, there was this expectation or hope that the opening up of the markets would lead into democratization, and that didn't end up happening. And I was wondering whether, in your opinion, there are other principles of organizing an economy that would lend themselves more to the advancement of democracy. And if there aren't any so far, should we maybe stop looking into the economy or like methods of organizing an economy as indicators or motivators of democratization?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. There are sort of these technical components about the way you might organize corporate governance, for example, that clearly seem to be better, more conducive to retaining that. Because what happens in democratization is that you have kind of a moment, the old regime falls, there's some broader wave, and there's usually kind of like a moment, and you need to sustain that momentum so it continues. Half of countries that democratize become authoritarian in some, I think, 10-year period or something like that. So it's a fragile environment. And so in the area that I'm aware of, the corporate governance, for example, you could really introduce laws or extra scrutiny to block holding, when large shares of companies are owned only by a few people. And so you could mandate significant shareholding by workers. But oddly, they try to do that in Russia during the privatization period. And because it was such an economic calamity, and the workers negotiated with their representatives, the Communist Party and first democratically elected parliament, negotiated on their behalf that workers would be given large portions of these companies. These shares effectively became worthless. These people sold them off for, for a week's paycheck or whatever, and they were collected by these few individuals. It was done illegally, it was done inappropriately, but the idea was there, but enforcing that, especially in those really fragile environments of democratizing countries, is just very difficult. On courts, I got into a little bit on the work on courts, and there's all these interesting technical details of how you arrange appointment of judges. For example, it might be better in the United States that the federal judges or Supreme Court judges are approved by the Senate, but it might be better that it would be a collegium of retired judges that appoints and reviews their records, as is done often in local, state-level courts and the like. So there's a variety of those types of things, minutia organizing that whole edifice, that seem to maybe work better. But it's hard to have those detailed conversations amidst these moments of turbulence and the like. And so that's when, if an opportunity like that arises in some of these places like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia, maybe Hungary and whatnot, hopefully they'll invite some academic from some library somewhere who does stuff to the old shoulder pads, I guess, and try to say something useful. But in reality, the implementation of these minutiae is quite that doesn't get brought up in public discourse because bigger things are at stake.
So we are at time, but we did have one more question. So let me go ahead and take this, and then we will all go off and get some food.
Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I wanted to ask a little bit about the conditions for market access that you had mentioned before, because it feels like we're coming at this crux. On the one hand, conditional market access might incentivize rule of law and democratization, but on the other hand, it might decrease cooperation on global issues, which might decrease the legitimacy of democracy. So I'm wondering how you might balance this issue, especially when we're facing huge global issues such as COVID and climate action and things like that.
Well, I think, by market access, and Western countries who, for various historical reasons, were much richer countries, let's say that the modern age of globalization began, have historically used ability to access their markets as a political tool to push particular courses of economic development. It was done under the Marshall Plan of the Europeans by the United States and also with Japan. It was done with, when these so-called Asian tigers were becoming much more, much richer, growing fast. It was done in Korea, Singapore. To some extent, there was a policy towards China, an idea that our Walmart shelves will be open to you, so to speak, but in exchange we want this and that and that. And the arguments both on the left and the right is that America maybe hasn't gotten enough in return, whatnot. And so long as there's this disparity and there's a power of that Western market, but that could also change in a little bit. China was making all this progress in becoming a more consumer-oriented economy, and becoming the largest market for light vehicles, the largest market for electronics, the largest market for financial services, for computer services, for information technology services. And so if China remains in this trajectory and becomes a very, let's say, largest market, then China will have that power as well. And so that will be a different types of game. But I think the prospects for global cooperation, I think, are as slim as they've ever been, maybe, on some of these issues. But the good news maybe is that the Western countries probably have an easier time organizing, and because so much technological know-how and spending power stands behind the richer Western countries, the actual progress maybe could be more significant, and it was done in a kind of universal consensus kind of model. So maybe less cooperation, but maybe more action, perhaps, hopefully, trying to influence. Yeah, right.
So we are at time, so I want to thank Professor Logvinenko for joining us.